Dandavat Pranam. Namaste.
Namaste.
I'm here with Srimati Kanupriya Didi, and we are continuing our reading of GWF Hegel's Aesthetics. So, now granted that the work of art is made by man as the creation of his spirit, a final question arises. A final question arises in order to derive a deeper result from the foregoing discussion. Namely, what is man's need to produce works of art? On one hand, this production may be regarded as a mere play of chance and fancies, which might just as well be left alone as pursued. For it might be held that there are other and even better means of achieving what art aims at, and that man has still higher and more important interests than art as the ability to satisfy. On the other hand, however, art seems to proceed from a higher impulse and to satisfy higher needs. At times, the highest and absolute needs, since it is bound up with the most universal views of life and the religious interests of the whole epochs and peoples. This question about the non-contingent but absolute need for art we cannot yet answer completely, because it is more concrete than an answer could turn out to be at this stage. Therefore, we must content ourselves in the meantime with making only the following points. The universal and absolute need from which art, on its formal side, springs, has its origin in the fact that man is a thinking consciousness, i.e., that man draws out of himself and puts before himself what he is and whatever else is. Things in nature are only immediate and single, while man as spirit duplicates himself in that, one, he is as things in nature are, but two, he is just as much for himself. He sees himself, represents himself to himself, thinks, and only on the strength of this active placing himself before himself is he spirit. This consciousness of himself man acquires in a twofold way. First, theoretically, insofar as inwardly he must bring himself into his own consciousness, along with whatever moves, stirs, and presses in the human breast. And in general, he must see himself, represent himself to himself, fix before himself what thinking finds as his essence, and recognize himself alone, alike in what is summoned out of himself and in what is accepted from without. Secondly, man brings himself before himself by practical activity, since he has the impulse in whatever is directly given to him, in what is present to him externally, to produce himself, and therein equally to recognize himself. This aim he achieves by altering external things, whereon he impresses the seal of his inner being, and in which he now finds again his own characteristics. Man does this in order, as a free subject, to strip the external world of its inflexible foreignness, and to enjoy in the shape of things only an external realization of himself. Even a child's first impulse involves this practical alteration of external things. A boy throws stones into a river and now marvels at the circles drawn in the water as an effect in which he gains an intuition of something. That is his own doing. This need runs through the most diversiform phenomena up to that mode of self-production in external things which is present in the work of art. And it is not only with external things that man proceeds in this way. but no less with himself, with his own natural figure, which he does not leave as he finds it, but deliberately alters. Does not leave as he finds it, but deliberately alters. This is the cause of all dressing up and adornment, even if it be barbaric, tasteless, completely disfiguring, or even pernicious, like crushing the feet of Chinese ladies or slitting the ears and lips. For it is only among civilized people that alteration of figure, behavior, and every sort and mode of external expression proceeds from spiritual development. The universal need for art, that is to say, is man's rational need to lift the inner and outer world into his spiritual consciousness as an object in which he recognizes again his own self.
Mm.
The need for this spiritual freedom he satisfies, on the one hand, within by making what is within him explicit to himself, but correspondingly by giving outward reality to this explicit self, and thus in this duplication of himself by bringing what is in him into sight and knowledge for himself and others. This is the free rationality of man, in which all acting and knowing, as well as art too, have their basis and necessary origin. The specific need of art, however, in distinction from other action, political and moral, from religious portrayal and scientific knowledge, we shall see later in the introduction to Part 1. 2. The work of art as being for apprehension by man's senses is drawn from the sensuous sphere. So far, we have considered in the work of art the aspect in which it is made by man. We have now to pass on to its second characteristic, namely that it is produced for apprehension by man's senses, and therefore is more or less derived from the sensuous sphere. This reflection has given rise to the consideration that fine art is meant to arouse feeling, in particular the feeling that suits us, pleasant feeling. In this regard, the investigation of fine art has been made into an investigation of the feelings, and the question has been raised what feelings should be aroused by art, fear, for example, and pity. But how can these be agreeable? How can the treatment of misfortune afford satisfaction? Reflection on these lines dates especially from Moses Mendelssohn's times, 1729 to 1786. Über die Empfindungen from 1755 is the book of that person, or the Betrachtungen über das Erhaben from 1757. Okay. Reflection on these lines dates especially from Moses Mendelssohn's times, and many such discussions can be found in his writings. Yet such investigation did not get far, because feeling is the indefinite, dull region of the spirit. What is felt remains enveloped in the form of the most abstract, individual subjectivity, and therefore differences between feelings are also completely abstract, not differences in the thing itself. For example, fear, anxiety, alarm, terror are of course further modifications of one and the same sort of feeling, but in part they are only quantitative intensifications, in part just forms not affecting their content, but indifferent to it. In the case of fear, for example, something is present in which the subject has an interest, but at the same time he sees the approach of the negative which threatens to destroy what he is interested in. And now he finds directly in himself the interest and the negative, both as contradictory affections of his subjectivity. But such fear cannot by itself condition any content. On the contrary, it is capable of receiving into itself the most varied and opposite contents. You can be afraid of all sorts of things, but being afraid does not determine what you're afraid of. From Bosanquet's note on page 98. Feeling as such is an entirely empty form of subjective affection. Of course, this form may be manifold in itself as hope, grief, joy, pleasure, and again, in this variety, it may encompass different contents as there is a feeling for justice, moral feeling, sublime religious feeling, and so on. But the fact that such content, e.g. justice, is present in different forms of feeling, e.g. hope or grief, is not enough to bring to light its essential and specific nature. Feeling remains a purely subjective emotional state of mind in which the concrete thing vanishes, contradicted into a circle of the greatest abstraction. This is obscure, but the meaning would seem to be that morality, justice, etc. vanish when contracted into the circle of my private feeling, which is abstract or ill-defined in comparison with their concreteness. Consequently, the investigation of the feelings which art evokes, or is supposed to evoke, does not get beyond vagueness. It is a study which precisely abstracts from the content proper and its concrete essence and concept. For reflection on feeling is satisfied with observing subjective emotional reaction in its particular character. Instead of immersing itself in the thing at issue, i.e. in the work of art, plumbing its depths, and in addition relinquishing mere subjectivity in its states. But in the case of feeling, it is precisely this empty subjectivity which is not only retained, but is the chief thing. And this is why men are so fond of having feelings. But this too is why a study of this kind becomes wearisome on account of its indefiniteness and emptiness, and disagreeable by its concentration on tiny subjective peculiarities. B. But since the work of art is not, as may be supposed, meant merely in general to arouse feelings, for in that case it would have this aim in common without any specific difference with oratory, historical writing, religious edification, etc., but to do so only in so far as it is beautiful. Reflection on the beautiful hit upon the idea of looking for a peculiar feeling of the beautiful and finding a specific sense of beauty. In this quest, it soon appeared that such a sense is no blind instinct made firmly definite by nature, capable from the start, in and by itself, of distinguishing beauty. Hence, education was demanded for this sense, and the educated sense of beauty was called taste, which, although an educated appreciation and discovery of beauty, was supposed to remain still in the guise of immediate feeling. We have already, on page 16, touched on how abstract theories undertook to educate such a sense of taste, and how it itself remained external and one-sided. Criticism at the time of these views was on the one hand deficient in universal principles. On the other hand, as a particular criticism of individual works of art, it aimed less at grounding a more definite judgment in the implements. It aimed less at grounding a more definite judgment, the implements for making one being not yet available, than at advancing rather the education of taste in general. Thus, this education likewise got no further than what was rather vague, and it labored only by reflection, so to equip feeling as a sense of beauty, that now it could find beauty wherever and however it existed. Yet the depths of the thing remained a sealed book to taste, since these depths require not only sensing and abstract reflections, but the entirety of reason and the solidity of the spirit, while taste was directed only to the external surface on which feelings play and where one-sided principles may pass as valid. Consequently, however, so-called good taste takes fright at all the deeper effects of art, and is silent when the thing at issue comes in question, and externalities and incidentals vanish. For when great passions and the movements of a profound soul are revealed, there is no longer any question of the finer distinctions of taste and its pedantic preoccupation with individual details. It feels genius striding over such ground, and retreating before its power, finds the place too hot for itself, and knows not what to do with itself. C. For this reason, the study of works of art has given up keeping in view merely the education of taste and proposing only to exhibit taste. The connoisseur has taken the place of the man of taste, or the judge of artistic taste. The positive side of the connoisseurship, insofar as it concerns a thorough acquaintance with the whole sweep of the individual character of a work of art, we have already on page 14 described as necessary for the study of art. For on account of its nature, at once material and individual, the work of art issues essentially from particular conditions of the most varied sort, amongst them especially the time and place of its origin, then the specific individuality of the artist, and above all, the technical development of his art. Attention to all these aspects is indispensable for a distinct and thorough insight into and acquaintance with a work of art, and indeed for the enjoyment of it. With them, connoisseurship is principally preoccupied, and what it achieves in its way is to be accepted with gratitude. Now, while such scholarship is justly counted as something essential, it still may not be taken as the single and supreme element in the relation which the spirit adopts to a work of art and to art in general. For connoisseurship, and this is its defective side, may stick at acquaintance with purely external aspects, the technical, historical, etc., and perhaps have little notion of the true nature of the work of art, or even know nothing of it at all. Indeed, it can even disesteem the value of deeper studies in comparison with purely positive technical and historical information. Yet censorship, if it be of a genuine kind, does itself strive at least for specific grounds and information, and for an intelligent judgment with which, after all, is bound up more precise discrimination of the different, even if partly external, aspects of a work of art and the evaluation of these. D. After these remarks on the modes of study occasioned by that aspect of the work of art which, as itself a sensuous object, gave it an essential relation to men as sensuous beings, we propose now to treat this aspect in its more essential bearing on art itself, namely, in regard to the work of art as an object, and B, in regard to the subjectivity of the artist, his genius, talent, etc., yet without our entering upon what in this connection can proceed only from the knowledge of art in its universal essence. For here, we are not yet really on scientific ground and territory. We are still only in the province of external reflections. A. Of course, the work of art presents itself to the sensuous apprehension. It is therefore sensuous feeling, external or internal, for sensuous intuition and ideas, just as nature is, whether the external nature that surrounds us or our own sensitive nature within. After all, a speech, for example, may be addressed to sensuous ideas and feelings, but nevertheless, the work of art as a sensuous object is not merely for sensuous apprehension. Its standing is of such a kind though sensuous, it is essentially at the same time for spiritual apprehension. The spirit is meant to be affected by it, and to find some satisfaction in it. Now the fact that this is what the work of art is meant to be explains at once how it can in no way be a natural product or have in its natural aspect a natural vitality. whether a natural product is supposed to have a higher or lower value than a mere work of art, as a work of art is often called a depreciatory sense, called in a depreciatory sense. For the sensuous element in a work of art, it should be there only insofar as it exists for the human spirit, regardless of its existing independently as a sensuous object. If we examine more closely in what way the sensuous is there for man, we find that what is sensuous can be related in various ways to the spirit. AA. The poorest mode of apprehension, the least adequate to spirit, is purely sensuous apprehension. It consists in the first place of merely looking on, hearing, feeling, etc., just as in hours of spiritual fatigue. Indeed, for many people at any time, it may be an amusement to wander around without thinking, just to listen, hear, and look around there, and so on. Spirit does not stop at the mere apprehension of the external world by sight and hearing. It makes it into an object for its inner being, which then is itself driven, once again in the form of sensuousness, to realize itself in things, and relates itself to them as desire. In this appetitive relation to the external world, man, as a sensuous individual, confronts things as being individuals. Likewise, he does not turn his mind to them as a thinker with universal categories. Instead, in accord with individual impulses and interests, he relates himself to the objects, individuals themselves, and maintains himself in them by using and consuming them. And by sacrificing them, works his own self-satisfaction. In this negative relation, desire requires for itself not merely the superficial appearance of external things, but the things themselves in their concrete physical existence. With mere pictures of the wood that it might use, or of the animals it might want to eat, desire is not served. Neither can desire let the object persist in its freedom, for its impulse drives it just to cancel this independence and freedom of external things, and to show that they are only there to be destroyed and consumed. But at the same time, the person too, caught up in the individual, restricted and nugatory interest of his desire, is neither free in himself, since he is not determined by the essential universality and rationality of his will, nor free in respect of the external world, for his desire remains essentially determined by external things and related to them. Now, this relation of desire is not the one in which man stands to the work of art. He leaves it free as an object to exist on its own account. He relates himself to it without desire, as to an object which is for the contemplative side of spirit alone. Consequently, the work of art, though it has sensuous existence, does not require in this respect a sensuously concrete being and natural life. Indeed, it ought not to remain on this level, seeing that it is meant to satisfy purely spiritual interests and exclude all desire from itself. Hence, it is true that practical desire rates organic and inorganic individual things in nature, which can serve its purpose, higher than works of art, which show themselves useless to serve it and are enjoyable only by other forms of the spirit. Maybe we should end here for today.
Yes, probably no problem. Nice reading. Interesting. Earlier on, we was talking about, the sort of almost like the basic human function of creating is to see itself or feel itself through that creation, through creating something. Um, I thought that was an interesting analogy. About reflection of being human in a sense, or the human desire to create is just merely to see itself. Um, nice. You have any thoughts or anything?
But I think based on what you were just saying, he is saying that that impetus of spirit to make its imprint on external things in order to see itself,
Mm.
that's the most immediate expression of spirit in nature. So
Mm.
so that's just at the very beginning of the process of spirit becoming self-conscious,
Mm.
because then, the idea is that once spirit is starting to recognize that it's different from nature by
Mm.
seeing its own effect on nature, then it starts to, that immediacy becomes mediated through deeper reflection on the self, and eventually um, on the relationship of the self with the supreme self.
Mm. And also the inner outer worlds, the inner and the outer worlds.
Yeah, but like where the outer is meant to just get the attention of the unconscious spirit in order to then redirect it into itself.
Mm. Yeah.
And I can see here, from the very shallow background I have from, the small things that I've learned from Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj so far, where Hegel's whole project is about this process of spirit coming to know itself as spirit in a very systematic way, where every step of that system is incredibly meaningful and
Mm.
very thoroughly thought out, and important to see the necessity of each step and the necessity of how one step comes from the other step.
Yeah.
And so the fact that art is one of those things, and then try to become really aware and thoughtful and conscious of how that develops into science, philosophy, religion, necessarily, I think is super important for being very clear and sober about, okay, so now we know how to utilize art. We can understand very concisely what is the purpose of art in comparison to what is the purpose of science, philosophy, religion, which go beyond art. So we shouldn't try to like be fuzzy or approach art with some kind of ill defined or unreasonable expectations, because then it can really, then whatever art is actually meant to express in that process of spirit coming to know itself as spirit, it can be expressed like super, nicely, I think, because of that clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think here he's starting to, he's even saying, it's still, this hasn't become a science of art yet. Still, he's
Mm.
just kind of describing things in the vague
Yeah.
feelings that we have of the impressions of outer things, and he's slowly building up to how does that become a science
Mm-hmm. Mm.
of art.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. So we were on page 36.
Yeah, we left off on page 37 on BB. the capital DD.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I remember. Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's also interesting to maybe reflect on here where he's saying feeling is the most vague thing in nature,
Mm.
right? Because nature is the reflect like the spirit is the tree on the shore of a lake, then nature is the reflection of the tree in that lake. So if this and so this ambiguity of feeling in nature is at the bottom of the subjective faculties where like thinking is higher there, but then but that's in the reflection of nature, which is not yet transcendental or spiritual, because obviously right in Veda, feeling is actually at the top.
Mm.
So whatever is at the top of the real tree, when it's reflected, in the reflection of it, it's at the bottom.
Mm.
So
Yeah. So in the material conception, you're saying that it's on a material basis, it's a lower thing.
yeah,
Mm.
Sripad Puri Maharaj emphasizes that point a lot. The things that are lowest in the material world are the things that are the highest in the spiritual world. Or the sexual exploitation in the material world is the lowest, right? Having some kind of a extramarital affair in the material world is like considered, like low class. But that's the highest bhava in Krishna's Leela,
It's
Parakiya,
very
I'll say.
funny and that's very, very hard to conceive of some of these things. But yeah, so I understand. That's interesting, that reflection, those backward things.
Yeah, because I
Mm.
mean, it's very the whole idea of being in nature, being in that reflection of spirit. The reason that's the Bahiranga Shakti, the external energy of the Lord. That's nature, and it's uh, the reason that spirit is absorbed in that external and the externality of nature is because it's in that self-centered frame of reference for seeking satisfaction. So of course, when the highest thing means centered on the infinite, everything has its proper is situated properly when the frame of reference is within the purposes of the infinite.
Mm.
So when the finite perverts that by putting themselves in the center, the finite in the center, and then tries to enjoy the highest things of the infinite, it becomes, super grotesque. It becomes the most,
Mm.
because it's not meant for the finite's satisfaction isolated from the infinite. It's
Mm.
only meant for the satisfaction of the infinite, in which the finite is a participant and does derive some pleasure, but only as a secondary thing.
Mm. Mm. Well, as a secondary, as a almost, I suppose, like I'm trying to think of the word, but not like a vessel, but like a participant, like you're saying, like a participant, but it's secondary in its position. But through that, you're getting satisfied. But through that's where the satisfaction comes then,
Yeah,
of
that's where,
spirit, surely, because ultimately you could say that, people are essentially looking for, they're searching, like the book, Search for Sri Krishna, Reality, the Beautiful. People are searching unconsciously or consciously for that fulfillment of spirit, but just looking in the wrong place. They're, identifying it with the wrong place, like you're saying, with when they identify themselves with, me, my, and I, or that separateness, that separate interest, then it's never satisfied. It's always temporary. But if you're engaging your work or your art process, or your nature, whatever nature you have, if you're engaging that in the service of the Lord or satisfaction of the Lord, then you're kind of like plugging in, you're like connecting with the spirit. You know, the spirit is then satisfied on some level. It's although I suppose, you know, it's like an ongoing thing, sort of forever, like you're saying, like Krishna is forever new, forever fresh, we're forever searching in a sense, but still there's that sense of beauty, and I think that's where beauty's truly found.
Yes.
So yeah, it's nice reading. Nice reading.
Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Srila Guru Maharaj, Srila Gurudev, Srila Acharya Dev, Srila Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Rupanuga Guru Varga Ki Jai.
Jai.
Jai Navadvip Dham Ki Jai, Mayapur Dham Ki Jai, Nrsimhapuri Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai, Baladev Subhadra Jagannath Ju Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai, Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Giri Govardhan Gupta Govardhan Dham Ki Jai, Sham Kund Radha Kund Ki Jai, Tulsi Devi Bhakti Devi, Vrinda Devi Ki Jai, Jai Harinam Sankirtan Yagya Ki Jai, Scientific Sankirtan Yagya Ki Jai, Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mutt Ki Jai, Jai. Sama Bhakti Veda Vrinda Ki Jai, Jai Srimati Kanu Priya Devi Dasi Ki Jai, Nitai Gaur Pramanandi, Hari 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 Bol.
Krishna Keshava Das Prabhu Ki Jai. Hare Krishna, thank
Hare
you.
Krishna Deity, Dhanavad Pranam.
Dhanyavad.